Welcome to another episode of Eberhart Outdoors. I've had some strange hunts over the years, and this bow hunt in 2000 with my son Chris was definitely one of them. Deep down, I'm a bow hunter that prefers to hunt alone, and that's a very difficult thing to admit, especially when I had 3 adult sons that were avid bow hunters. I say had because Chris lost his battle to cancer a couple of years ago. Well, I took them hunting when they were growing up. I've always known that if you're pursuing mature bucks in a heavily pressured area, that hunting with another hunter dramatically decreases your odds of being successful. Since I exclusively hunt on either public or free permission properties, and in the most heavily bow hunted state in the country by about 60,000 bow hunters, I like knowing that if there were a mistake made that could potentially alter the course of a future hunt, that I made it. There have been times when I've taken other bow hunters hunting and they never told me about something they did wrong until after I had wasted a hunt at that same location. Some examples would be they were winded, they got picked, deer would spook by smelling their entry routes. That's for the guys that didn't have a scent control regimen. And one guy actually missed the target buck, which is fine, that happens. But by the time he told me, I had hunted the same compromised location twice. Unlike TV Fantasyland, in heavily pressured areas, the odds of getting a second opportunity at a mature buck after he was missed is pretty close to or below 0. It just does not happen. They don't make the same mistake twice. Those are all very common mistakes, especially for hunters that don't have a scent control regimen that works. Obviously, my son Chris was using the exact same scent control regimen as me, but by the year 2000, I was still a bit hesitant about him hunting with me during the best week of the season. You're right, that's pretty small of me, but that's the reality. With that being said, I sucked up my self-interest ego and was excited about having Chris, who resided in Germany at the time, fly home to hunt a week with John, and then John was going to pass him off for the first week of November with me. Chris was very cognizant of the fact that the last week in October and the first week of November were the absolute best 2 weeks to hunt. And although he hadn't bow hunted whitetails in a few years, through our conversations over the phone, it was obvious that he missed it. John had taken a nice 8-point from public land on opening morning, which was October 1st, and then he put Chris in that same location, and Chris took a 1.5-year-old 7-point just to break the ice. After passing up on several other small state land bucks during the remainder of his hunt with John, he came down and hunted with me. It was my hope to have one good buck tagged prior to us hunting together, but that didn't happen. In fact, I hadn't even seen a good buck during the entire month of October. Hopefully November, and with Chris coming down, that would be a new chapter. All 3 of my kids also hunt from saddles and use properly cared for and stored scent lock suits and pay 0 attention to wind direction. So all my setups were suitable for Chris, and I would have no concerns about him getting winded, as I had with every other hunter I've ever hunted with in the past. The plan was for Chris to drive down to southern Michigan on November 1st and meet up with me for lunch and then hunt the afternoon on some public land. Because I did not have a target buck to hunt, I was hunting buck sign and situational terrain features. I live in central Michigan, but I was actually down in southern Michigan for the week he was going to be there because there's just bigger bucks in southern Michigan and your odds of killing a book buck are better. Since I was already down there, I went hunting that morning and was set up about 25 feet up in a very difficult to climb large diameter red oak, and it had 3 large branches around the base of my feet to help block my body profile from getting picked. There were also 2 active scrapes beneath it. The red oak is centered in about a 100-yard wide transition zone separating large stands of timber to the southwest and northeast. The ground had quite a bit of security cover in the form of briar bushes, autumn olive, and red brush. To the northwest of the transition zone was a picked cornfield, and to the southeast was a large, really tall weed field which acted as a bedding area. At 8:45 that morning, the only deer I saw was a tall, tined 8-point, and he cut the inside corner of the picked cornfield while scent checking for does that may have left the field earlier that morning. One of the many advantages a saddle has over tree stands is that you can have as many preset locations as you want while owning just one saddle. I typically have at least 40 locations ready to hunt before the season begins, and normally I will only hunt about a dozen of them. The reasoning for that is things just change from year to year. A lot of times transition zones will change because of crop rotations or master fruit production on the property. This was one of those times where I actually had a maple tree ready to hunt that was within 25 yards of the corner of the picked cornfield, which would have put that buck 10 yards away. And that's the tree I would put Chris in that evening. After lunch, I took Chris to the maple, and then I had to decide where to go. I had not had a spot for me to hunt. If I hunted the red oak where I was in the morning, there would have been at least a 20-yard overlap of shooting area, as our trees would have been about 30 yards apart. So that was out of the question. Knowing I would have to freelance to find a location, I brought a freelance pack loaded with Cranford strap-on steps. I freelanced into the timber to the northeast in search of any sign that looked decent, as I expected Chris's location to be the most promising. After searching for a couple hundred yards, I found a large poplar tree with well-used runways on each side, and both runways dumped into the tall weed field bedding area to the south. One of the runways had several fresh rubs along it that were high off the ground, indicating an older, taller buck, also something with taller tines. We were both in our trees by 3 p.m., and our early arrival made a big difference in the outcome of the hunt, as at 3:15, Chris heard a deer transitioning through the timber southwest of him, towards the corner he was in. Unfortunately, it was a 3-point, and he was allowed to cut the corner and continue on into the timber to the northeast. As the little guy passed, Chris saw a doe step out into the picked corn, and the little buck saw her as well, and he took off in pursuit. He chased her around in the open field for a few minutes before they both disappeared into the woods. After a few minutes, the 3-point passed by Chris again and went back on about his business, whatever that was. Around 5:10, and flicker through the trees caught Chris's attention, and it was a good buck coming his way from the northeast, and as he neared, it was the tall 8-point I had told him to expect. As he was cruising through the inside edge of the timber along the cornfield, a couple more does entered the cut corn about 80 yards west of Chris. Even though the buck noticed them, he had no interest and continued browsing towards Chris's location. Instead of cutting tight to the corner as he had in the morning, he was browsing on briar leaves and fed through the timber about 40 yards from the field's edge, which would put him about 15 yards from Chris, and at one point Chris said he was browsing right down his entry route. Wide open and 17 yards and quartering slightly towards him, Chris drew and picked his spot and took the shot. He was surprised to see half of his arrow sticking out of the buck as he turned and bolted away, heading northeast with his tail up for about 100 yards before going out of sight. Chris thought the shot was a bit high, but not so much that it wouldn't have taken out both lungs. And then he was thinking, that really doesn't mesh, because that deer just ran at least 100 yards without any signs of tipping over. Then he heard what he thought was a death crash. Sitting in his saddle, he had mixed emotions. He was happy to have killed such a nice buck, but was disappointed with his high shot placement. The buck was in a slight depression area when Chris shot, and he thought that maybe he hadn't quite played the angle correctly for the 30-plus feet height he was above the deer. Chris had lived in Germany for 7 years and had taken quite a few roe deer, but he was only hunting about 15 to 20 feet high in his saddle when hunting them. So the trajectory angles were quite different, which will typically cause you to shoot high. I heard the commotion from where Chris was hunting, and within several seconds after that commotion, I saw the large 8-point running through the hardwoods to the northwest of me. After watching him run over 150 yards, he stopped about 70 yards due north of me and looked down the hill towards Chris. Within moments, a 3-point, which had been standing about 30 yards from where the big buck stopped, took off, crashing through the brush as he ran north. That crash of brush from the 3-point must have been what Chris had heard and thought it was the crash of the 8-point expiring. The 8-point just stood there like a statue looking down into the valley where Chris was. He had traveled a long distance from where Chris was, and I was waiting for him to tip over, because the original commotion I heard had to be Chris shooting at this buck. Thinking back, I couldn't think of any time when Chris had missed a deer, and he had taken many. Looking at the buck, however, I couldn't see any wound or blood on his sleek coat. My stand location was now right between the buck and the tall weed field bedding area to the south of me. What were the odds of Chris missing a chip shot and then of me choosing the exact same exit route he would choose to go back into the bedding area? I thought the odds of that were extremely slim, but it looks like that was going to be a possibility. I was now counting on him passing by me down the rub-lined runway heading back into the bedding area. He didn't let me down as he turned his head in my direction and began slowly moving south down the runway. The tree foliage was down and the popple tree wasn't that big, which brought another saddle advantage into play at this point. When the buck stopped 70 yards away, I moved over a step to the left, so I was totally using the tree trunk to hide my body profile so as not to get picked, because everything was vertical in the woods. Peeking to the side of the tree, I watched as about every 5 yards he would stop and look towards Chris. Chris had hit the buck on the right side, and I was looking at the buck's left side, and there was no sign of a hit, and Chris's arrow was no longer in him. It was dead quiet, and this buck was on edge as he slowly continued south down the rub-lined runway. As he moved closer, I was cautiously leaning to the right to keep the tree trunk as a hiding buffer between us. I waited for him to pass by the tree so he wouldn't pick my draw motion with his peripheral vision, and once slightly past the tree and quartering away at 14 yards, I drew my 60-pound Golden Eagle Evolution bow, placed my pin on his moving chest, and made a very soft vocal domat to stop him. He immediately stopped and wrenched his head around to look in my direction. Now his head and antlers were blocking my shot at his chest, so I put the pin further back on his liver area and opened my fingers to release the Carbon Express 300 arrow, tipped with a rocket sidewinder mechanical head. The 8-point was very tense when I took the shot, and I knew if I would have waited for him to move his head, the odds are very high that he would have just taken off before that happened. The arrow entered right where I aimed, and he took off running through the timber to the east and out of sight over a knoll. Many things went through my mind as I sat there wondering. Perhaps Chris had shot a different buck that was traveling with this one, as I never saw any wound on the side of this deer or an arrow. The thought of him missing never even entered my mind. And while there was still a lot of daylight, after about 30 minutes, I got down and went over to Chris, and fortunately that was in the exact opposite direction that the buck had went. Chris had already gotten out of his tree, and he asked if I'd seen the 8-point expired near me because it went somewhat in that direction. Slightly shocked by his question, I asked him if he was sure he hit it. He assured me he had, but did admit the shot was quite high. Now there was no doubt that the buck Chris hit was also the buck that I hit, because the foliage was mostly down and the woods was too open for me not to see another buck if it came in my direction. Not wanting to take a chance on spooking the buck before he expired with what I was sure was a liver hit by me, we left the scene in the opposite direction. I knew if he wasn't dead and we pushed him into the tall weed field that our chances of recovery would diminish a bit, and also the tall weed field was on private property that I did not have permission on. When we returned the next morning, the buck was nice and neatly expired in a bedded position, not 100 yards from where I had shot him. Whenever a deer is recovered and it is in a bedded position, it didn't die on the run. It bled out while bedded. While dressing him, Chris and I were careful to inspect all the vitals. Chris's arrow had entered just below the spine and through the loin above his right shoulder and hit his left leg bone, which was obviously not a killing shot. My arrow had passed through the front portion of his liver where all the larger veins entered it. I felt a bit uneasy about the situation because had Chris not wounded the buck, I never would have gotten the shot. But Chris took it well, put his arm around my shoulder, and congratulated me. Then, like an ass, which I can be at times, I thanked him for sending the nice buck my direction, but I would have much rather he put the killing shot on him. There's an old saying about first blood. We have taken enough deer to be realists about what is and what is not a vital shot, and we both agreed that this was not a vital shot by Chris. However, every time I look at the 8-point mounted on the wall, I think of it as our buck. On the positive side for me, I picked out the perfect freelance location as it was the exact exit or entry route the buck was comfortable using going in and out of that bedding area. 2 days later, on the other side of the state with Chris, I killed Weezer, which was another big 8-point, and that was the end of my season. Chris ended his vacation going back up to John's and hunting with John a few more days. If interested, the links to many of the podcasts I've been on, or for information about my 2-day whitetail workshops that take place in March and April, please visit my website at deer-john.net. Thank you for watching another episode of Eberhart Outdoors, and to receive notifications for future videos, please subscribe.